Greetings, everyone. We welcome you to this particular session. It is called Developing a 60-Year Curriculum for a 100-Year Life. I'm Bill Griffith. I'm the anchor at large at CNBC. That's TV talk for I'm happily retired. There is no question that we are living longer these days. The children born this year in 2020 have a better than 50% chance of living to the age of 100. A century ago, that percentage was only 1 to 2%. Now, living longer generally means we will be working longer. Research today says that millennials in that generation right now will have to work on average about 60 years in order to earn enough money to retire on. Hence, the movement in recent years in academia to develop what is called a 60-year curriculum. And that's what we're going to talk about over the next 43 minutes here. And we'll be taking your questions in a little while. We look forward to hearing what is on your mind. But in the meantime, meet our distinguished panel members. They are experts in their respective fields. Andrew Scott is professor of economics at the London Business School. His book is called The 100-Year Life. Chris Dede is professor in learning technologies at Harvard's Graduate School of Education. His book is called The 60-Year Curriculum. Rovy Branon is vice provost for Continuum College at the University of Washington. He and his team are working on 60-year curriculum models. And Yakut Gazi is associate dean for learning systems at Georgia Tech Professional Education. She and her team, it's very interesting, are developing platforms that will facilitate future continuing education models like the 60-year curriculum. I welcome all of you. Thank you for joining us and spending some time with us. Andrew, I want to start with you. A phenomenon of the 20th century was the three-step lifespan that people generally had: education, employment, and retirement. You argue in your book that this longer lifespan, the 100-year life, will necessitate multiple stages in a person's life, and education will play a role in each of those stages, yes?
Absolutely. I mean, time is a social convention, and as life gets longer, in roughly every generation has been living up almost a decade longer than the previous one, we need to restructure life. The 20th century saw the invention of teenagers and pensioners, and now we're seeing whole new stages of life. We're seeing people in their 20s behave very differently, people in their 40s and 50s. And if you do that maths, if you are living to your 90s or 100, you will have to have a 50, 60-year career. And let's say you're going to work to your 70 and you start to work at 20, and I don't know how many people are in their mid-40s listening. That means you've got more work to go than you've done already, which is a pretty sobering thought for lots of people. So, well, what skills do I need to future-proof given technology? Will my job still be there? Do I want to carry on doing what I'm doing? Because it could get rather boring and rather dull. And will I be able to? So what we'll see is people have a multi-stage life where they may have several different careers, doing different things. And of course, that will require change and transition, which of course brings us into the need to get new skills. But also I think it's something about narration, because education isn't just about getting skills for employment. It's also about sort of sorting out your values and your purpose and what you want to do. And we're going to need to refresh that much more. We're going to have to be much more open to change and transition, which wasn't encouraged in the three-stage life. You really sort of had your adolescent transition time, then a career, and then you had retirement. But I mean, a lot of changes along the way.
Chris, speaking of which, in the concept of the 60-year curriculum, are we talking about new kinds of degrees or credentials or certificate? I mean, is that what we'll be trying to achieve over time, or how does that work?
We'll certainly be moving towards forms of validating your knowledge and skills that are less time intensive and resource intensive than getting a full degree or even a full certification. And building on what Andrew was saying, it's not just that people are living longer, but that the rate of change and disruption in society is going to be very high for the next half century or so. The book was written before the pandemic, but the pandemic is just the tip of the iceberg. We've got climate change, we've got failure to meet the UN sustainability goals, artificial intelligence is getting more powerful and pretty soon jobs will have an AI partner that can either de-skill or upskill what the human being is doing. And so people will be making transitions all the time, some of them intentional, some of them involuntary, and they're not going to be able to go back for a degree or a full formal certification. It's going to have to be sort of continuous capacity building with lots of small ways of being able to validate what you've mastered. So universities, in a way, are moving out of the education business with degrees and courses, and they're moving into the continuous capacity building business, which is a very, very different territory.
Rovy, we hear so much about industries where companies cry that they can't find enough skilled workers. I'm mindful that you're sitting in Seattle, one of the great technology hubs. Bearing that in mind, are there industries where the demand will be greater for continuing education as part of this 60-year curriculum?
Well, I think as we sit here in Seattle, we know certainly tech companies have to retool their employees very, very rapidly. Tech does not stand still at all. Just earlier this week, I was in a meeting with leaders from one of the major tech companies here in Seattle, and we noted the coronavirus epidemic. We don't know exactly what the recovery is going to look like, but they're already speculating about a K-shaped recovery where the high-tech workers are going to be in incredible demand. And this is what they're seeing today. It was happening pre-pandemic, and now even during the pandemic, there's an acceleration of a need for very high-skilled workers. So I think the tech industry, the medical field certainly is also looking for additional personnel, but at very high levels. And so any of these fields where we see those professional fields are where we've seen this going on for a very long time in many ways. Tech has always had to retool rapidly. Medicine always has to retool rapidly. What we're starting to see is it's moving into other forms of industry. And here in Seattle, we have companies that aren't tech companies, but very large household names. And they also rely on technology, but their infrastructures require not just technological advancement, but also process advancement in terms of how they're thinking about the future. And so part of what we see large employers doing right now is creating incredible systems to help move employees within their own companies so they can use their own talent base to bring them into the organization. Some of them are beginning to realize they're going to need help to do that. So as we think about how universities and businesses work more closely together, we, for example, have over 100 certificate programs at the University of Washington. We have 80 advisory boards with people from these top industries that help us connect directly to employers. That's going to become more and more common because these short programs that Chris talks about and the long life that Andrew is talking about, if you think about that, we're going to have a deeper connectedness and a different kind of social compact between business, industry, institutions, and learners as we move forward.
Yeah, I want to explore that a little bit in a little while. First, Yakut, I'm fascinated. The pandemic certainly has been disruptive to the whole education industry. Schools have had to scramble at all levels to develop very quickly virtual classrooms, online classrooms, hybrid classrooms, so forth. This must be a huge case study for you and your team as you trying to figure out what platforms will look like in the future. This helps you figure out what works and what doesn't, right?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, these last 6 months have been fascinating. It's almost like a parallel universe that we woke up to. Places like Harvard is completely online, right? But I think, in my institution, we were prepared in a lot of ways to respond to this different type of scale. Let me just give you a context. We are a top 10 university, and my unit is the lifelong learning arm. We gained significant reputation, especially in the past 6 years, as a result of our ability to create freakishly affordable master's degrees. We have 3 degrees that are serving over 16,000 students that are all less than $10,000. I bring this up because I'm a firm believer that affordability and scale is at the heart of the 60-year curriculum, future of work, and future of education. So the way we approach these is not only the platform difference, but business model difference as well. We are we decrease the cost to the individual student by increasing the capacity of the classes using digital technologies. We find corporate partners because we align their interest and demand with our ability to offer those programs. They gift us the money to upfront the cost, and of course production primarily. And this way we are able to serve, right now, our average age is about 32 to 34 in these programs. About 95% of these students are already employed part-time or full-time. So this is truly an upskilling, reskilling effort, either within their own field or to make career changes. And the affordability, accessibility, and quality of these programs enable these learners to continue to their education without having to leave their families, leave work. And that's on the credit side. On the non-credit side, which are shorter sprints to reskill, we have a sizable, massive open online courses portfolio. And this is the interesting part. I mean, talking about acceleration. We just received some new data on the spike of our completion in these programs. Fall 19 to fall 20 comparison is 15,000 to over 94,000. So it's about 500% increase. And this gives us a pause, right? So what are people looking at? So we're now digging deeper into those fields that are producing that kind of impact.
Fascinating. The affordability issue is, I think, going to be something that's going to be important down the road. And I wonder the role that corporations will play in that. Chris, I'll ask a provocative question. Will the educators of the future involved with continuing education, will they be working for universities or will they be working for corporations who have their own private education programs?
I think it'll be more complicated than that. I think that yes, corporations will be providers. I think that universities will be providers. But I also think that we'll see new kinds of roles, like just as you have a financial manager, perhaps, that throughout your life guides you in making financial investments and isn't affiliated with a bank or with this stockbroker. It's somebody more neutral. We may see career coaches emerge that help you navigate a landscape in which, yes, you could get a certificate from a corporation, or you could get it from a university, or perhaps you could be in the job and accumulate credentials through job performance. So I think it'll be a better landscape in being more complex, because there'll be more options for the kind of people with trapped talent that Yakut was talking about, to be able to find affordable ways to build their capacity and to stay in touch with what the workplace is asking them to do.
Anyone?
I think that's right. I mean, we've got these trends of technology and longevity that are going to change what we learn, when we learn it, how we learn it, and who we learn it from. And there's going to be, if the logic of this, which I think has to be it right, with technology and longevity, is going to be a big increase in education, it has to come in later life. If you think about the size of the population, the sort of 18 to 24 age bracket, and 25 plus is 10 times bigger, a number investors always like, 10 times bigger than that 20 to 24 group. So this is a huge market, but it's going to be growing in areas where currently the system isn't very strong. And it's going to be growing, as we just talked about, in short courses. It's going to be growing in cumulative ones, non-degrees, much more employment-based. I'd say I don't get worried when employers say that university graduates aren't suitable for jobs, because I don't think it's the role of universities. I think it's the role of corporates. But these short courses will be much more based around employment skills.
Rovy, I'm sorry, what do you think? I mean, certainly the big technology companies, the Googles and the Facebooks and the Microsofts, I know they have their own campuses and things, but aren't we going to see companies that are crying that they don't have enough skilled workers, create those skilled workers by bringing them in and educating them with the specific skills that they need for their jobs? I mean, isn't that one of the models that is very viable down the road?
I think it's viable. There's one of the things that I think is going to happen here. Employers have done that for years, right? So it used to be the old model. You go through your four-year education, and you might come into a one-year training program at a new corporation 30 years ago, right? 40 years ago. If you were preparing for sales, when I used to work at Eli Lilly, that's a multi-month process of preparation. But right now, what's happened is societally, people don't stay at jobs more than 3 or 4 years, and employers, there's a lot of turnover. And so that contract has shifted. And so employers are still making investments in their employees on their own. But what we hear is where they've made those investments, they're actually coming back to universities and saying, as a not just as a need for our own skill base, but also our employees are asking for transferable credentials that make them more flexible in this workplace where they're unlikely to stay somewhere for 30 years. So the training, so yes, we are seeing more training within organizations to maximize their own talent pipelines, but a recognition that if you're not keeping that workforce for 30 to 40 years, you're going to have people transitioning in and out. And so you need the flexibility of having people with portability of their credentialing and their learning so that you can move employees in and out of that system more effectively. So it's going to be both. I think Chris mentioned the complications that we're going to see. We already have programs in the non-degree spaces where we are sharing curriculum with a major aircraft manufacturer, for example, and you asked about instructors. Some of those instructors have PhDs but work in business, and they teach in these programs jointly with faculty. And so that's where you get both the pragmatic side of what we're looking at, but also the future side that faculty can bring. And so these mixes are going to be different. They're going to be unique. And I do think some companies will invest more in training, but as many companies are doing right now, they're going to be looking for strong partners, both universities, but also private third-party companies that can provide outstanding training and portability to their employees.
Yakut, simply put, how does this kind of continuing education become affordable? How does that happen?
So the way we create it is, and that's the key thing, because I'm going to tie it to both what Chris and Rovy said. I think, we need to empower the individuals to take charge of their own learning. And then, depending on your employer to do that may not be a sustainable solution. So affordability is key. The way we achieve it is scale. So if we achieve a scale in a certain program, we can bring down the cost to an individual learner. And again, that is not independent from your partnerships with corporations, because those high demand fields usually attract those funds for the upfront costs. So it's a little bit, some people refer to it as being the Robin Hood, taking from the rich and giving it to the poor. But it's not easy, because it's a different way of thinking, and it's a different way of business modeling within higher education. But I also want to add one more thing. The importance of these new roles that learners can befriend along their lifetime to rebundle all this unbundling, to guide you. I mean, the learning coaches, the importance of those new roles, and how can higher education create and nourish those types of new roles is important. And it's not quite spoken yet, but there's an aspect of aging and learning. As people age, the brain plasticity degrades. So what are some things that can be done in terms of learning earlier in life, different pedagogies, andragogies, that will prepare folks for continuing to learn? How can we instill creativity? How can we instill curiosity and critical thinking? And I think that is a separate work that needs to be done. The first credential that you get that will prepare you, and compared to something that you build upon an existing, bachelor's degree or postgraduate degree.
I think that's
Andrew,
a really important point,
yes,
because we tend to think this is all being an add-on, but if you're going to do education later, it changes what you need to do at the beginning. And I slightly disagree with the notion that a lot of this tech will be around tech skills, because actually I think as machines get better and better, as they get more and more machine-like, education has to focus on very human skills. This is a great opportunity for humans to be more human-like. I'm good at maths and calculations, but I can't compete with a machine. So we do have to focus on those really core scientific skills, which is actually curiosity, formulating a hypothesis, testing it, and then those very softer human skills of how you interact with people and refresh yourself. And that's not easy. That's going to be a really hard thing to teach, but it does change what you do at the beginning. And that also links to the finances, because you've got to make things cheaper, because if I'm going to spend more money later, I can't spend so much at the beginning as well. So this is a pretty fundamental change. It's not just extending out, it's reformulating everything.
Chris, what role does artificial intelligence play in all of this? I mean, that has to be a part of the learning process, the teaching and the learning interaction that goes on, right?
Well, artificial intelligence is different than human intelligence. So it's not that the machines are getting better at doing what people do as biological minds, but it's getting better at doing certain aspects of jobs. And so once you have a partnership with a smart machine, it's doing what it does well, and ideally you're doing what you do well, but then you have to be prepared to do the human side, as Andrew is saying. But there's another piece of this I want to bring up, and that is the importance of unlearning. Once you're in a very turbulent time of change, once you are going to go through multiple careers rather than just multiple jobs, as adults, sometimes we have to unlearn some practices that we have that have become parts of our identity. So for example, you are in a command and control organization where you've been the leader, and now you're moving into a different role where it's distributed leadership and you're more the guide. That's a tough transition to make. And what we see in the university is people who are very skilled lecturers, as we move more and more into powerful forms of simulation and learning by doing, they have to unlearn some of their andragogy and learn it differently. So there's complexities in unlearning, not just to help other people with their careers, but for educators to handle their own careers.
I want to get to questions here in a moment. I did see one that came in, one asking for clarification, Chris asking what was the name of the book that you mentioned that came out before COVID. You were referring to your own book, the 60-year
it's a co-edited book called The
Yeah.
60-Year Curriculum. Andrew has a chapter in it. There's a chapter on the Georgia Tech work. Rovy has worked closely with the person who came up with the term, the 60-year curriculum. And it's called New Roles for Lifelong Learning in the Digital Age.
A question, Andrew, that it probably would be good for you. Is retirement a sort of 20th century construct that was good marketing at the time, but not useful for our lifelong well-being? Will retirement as we know it today become obsolete at some point?
Well, it sort of already has. The idea that there's a fixed date where everyone at the same age comes to a hard stop to work has already gone. So we're seeing a lot of people working later. So 10 years ago, I think 1 in 20 Americans were working over the age of 75. Today, it's 1 in 10. In 10 years' time, it will be more like 1 in 7. So we are already seeing a lot of people working afterwards. In the UK, 1 in 4 people who retire, unretire. They go and get another job. And then, of course, as that time extends, you're seeing people do very different things in retirement. And, actually, one of the secrets to longevity is having a sense of purpose and a sense of engagement. And I don't want to say that work is the only way to do that, because that's clearly not the case. But work is important for your finances and also for your health. And the data does suggest that if you're in a non-manual, non-physical job, the longer you work for, the longer you live, which is quite a thought.
It's interesting that you mentioned that, because we're actually seeing more people over the age of 65 coming back to earn certificates in programs that we might have thought as mid-career programs just 10 years ago. And so to see the number of people who say, I'm 65, now I'm ready to start my first business, there's no sign of slowing down, right? It's an acceleration in many ways.
Well, the business is a good one, because you do find there's a lot of ageism in hiring. Firms often, you're seeing firms, keep people working for longer, but when they lose a job, it's very hard to get a job. And so that's going to be a real problem with COVID. And so with that problem about getting a job, you're seeing a huge increase in entrepreneurial actions amongst older people. I want to go back to something Yakut said, which is that there's a big debate about the plasticity of the brain and our ability to learn. But what we do know is the brain shifts and changes over time. And there's no one age where you're kind of best at everything. And so your comparative advantage shifts. And I think that's a really important part of this sort of longer career, because you're going to have to change, as you get older, specialize in a different set of skills, because your brain is just working differently. Older people, young people have different skill sets. And of course, that's why having them work together is good, but it does have interesting issues, I think, for the education system.
There's something to be said for having institutional memory when it comes to certain industries. I've had experience along those lines. Yakut, you mentioned the ballooning of the number of people coming back for education. How much of that is also attributable to the situation with the economy? I know Rovy has done work on that as well, but finding economic downturns is the time when people do think more about continuing education, upgrading their skills, reinventing themselves. Are you seeing that as well happening right now?
I think it's a little early to say. I mean, most of us believe that we will see some of that spike, but in online programs, right? I think in the past economic downturn periods, the residential programs also received some of that coming back. And it may not be there because of the situation that we're in, but definitely a spike. And like what we see in our MOOC completions is at a larger spike than we saw in the past. So we can attribute a bit of that, if not most of that, to the situation that we're in. But if I may just add one more thing, I think, the assumptions that we make, the equity, the global thinking around all of these things. When we say, like US life expectancy is about 79 years, a little less than 79 years, which is world expectancy, I think is a little over 70, around 72. So there's a little bit of a gap, but we see more of those gaps within the US. So like in Atlanta, there's a life expectancy difference of 15 years between North and South Atlanta. And, the assumptions about people's access to education. Low SES students still enroll in college in a way, a much smaller rate than, I think it's 60% of their high SES peers. And it's important because I was actually very, appalled to see this. We tout programs such as boot camps as a boost to people's lifetime earnings, as well as their employment. But only about 20% of bootcamp learners are not bachelor's degree earners. So about 80% of these people have a bachelor's degree that they put the bootcamp credential on top of. So it's still very important to have that access to bachelor's education. And we have stark differences there. So as we talk about these alternative credentials, I think the currency still is bachelor's degree, that first credential that you can build upon. And I just don't want us to lose sight of that. And then there's equity issues that we need to be mindful of. We certainly deal with a certain population at Georgia Tech.
Right.
And we're a state institution. So I think Andrew has something to say.
He does.
Yeah, because I just want to echo this. I think this is absolutely key. And it's why I get a bit nervous when we talk about corporates and education. They've got a big role to play and they can really help scale things up. But, the US with the Industrial Revolution made sure that primary education was extended to everyone. And how we achieve that to adult education is going to be absolutely key because, education is a key way. If you think about the troubles you see in so many societies at the moment, we're about to go through a really big change akin to the Industrial Revolution. And political stability requires everyone feeling they get some economic benefit from it and feeling that they've got some voice in the political process. And education has a key role to play in that. And that's more than just skills and employment. And I think, that's the real task, because we know that the people who do adult education already have high levels of education. And I think that's the challenge we've really got to try and crack. And I think we've also got to recognize that governments mustn't just hope that education can turn out the skills for the new jobs of the future, but governments also have to think about creating the jobs for the skills that people have got, because not everyone's going to be able to retrain as a full stack developer. So I think it's a really important dual thing. It's not just the education sector. There has to be something else happening to the
economy. And building on that and speaking about equity, we need new policies. Right now we have unemployment insurance. So if you lose your job, you have some time to go look for the same job somewhere else. Or jobs are disappearing where there is no job somewhere else. What we need is something that's more like employability insurance, where you have a voucher that entitles you to a certain amount of education that you control, that you can choose the provider, that you can keep yourself continuously available for employment, even as society changes. That's a fundamental shift in how we think about power.
Another fundamental shift we're seeing, and I'm referring to a question that has come in, and it pertains to the impact COVID is having on all of this. The question is, will people stay on their jobs longer if we find a way to keep them remotely on the job so that there is higher satisfaction? There's no question that flexibility has become a byword now in the U.S. economy. And Chris, you're waving your head like you maybe don't agree with that, but anecdotally, we've all heard the stories about the people who are able to have the flexibility to either work at the office or stay home, and there's a greater satisfaction there. Does that change the dynamic of the need for greater continuing education or even looking for another career if you're willing to stay on the job. And Rovy, what do you think?
Well, I think Chris sort of ended with something that's really critical. And I think the choices are going to move more to the individual. And so it's going to be really up to people to retool. And as you're working independently, there may be less of that sense of connectedness. Businesses offer training classes as they're together. So I think on that side, it might take a little bit more work. I don't know that it's going to lead to people staying in jobs longer. I think the flexibility is there. I think flexibility is the key. I've got some staff who are ready to be back in the office and engaging with other human beings right now. And if they have to stay home one more day, they're going to go crazy. So for them, it is about the flexibility of coming back into the office and being able to participate. But I think this larger question is people will be operating more independently. At the University of Washington, we currently have 24 different programs now with the word data in the title. And so if you are out there by yourself, when we talked about services earlier, some of those are short programs, some of those are full degrees. They're in different areas of data science and data analytics, data visualization. And so even saying which of those is the right thing, if I'm working with a group of colleagues, there's going to be conversation. I went to this program, but you're going to have to be able to work with an educational institution or maybe one of these third-party concierges to say which is the right program for you, given where you are in your career, whether you're remote, whether you're in the office. I think that it's going to be important as people move into these modalities to understand that it also means a certain set of personal responsibility to be able to make these choices, which means you have to get educated about how you're going to educate yourself.
Yeah, Yakut, I want to hear your thought on that. And let me just ask you, in addition, have you found a difference in the quality or the impact of the education that people get, whether they are in person, a hybrid of some kind, or online, as we're talking about here?
Oh, we can take an entire hour and more just with that question. But if I can just add to the remote work conversation, there are discrepancies there as well that we need to watch out for. People with bachelor's degrees and above, according to U.S. Bureau of Statistics, have a large percentage of them are able to do remote work. And again, white workers, Asian workers seem to have more of an advantage there compared to Hispanic and Black workers in the US. So it's not an opportunity that is available to folks across the board. In terms of the quality, hybrid learning is the best of both worlds. But when I talk about hybrid learning, I'm talking about pre-COVID best practices hybrid learning. Our institutions, at least Georgia Tech, we have the same faculty, same curriculum, and same assessments in both of these modalities. And in fact, you would argue that the kind of individuals that are attracted to these programs, to give you an example, for the inaugural analytics class that we had, 25% of the individuals already had a master's or a doctoral degree coming into a master's program. 7% were C-suite level individuals. So who do you go to school with is an important aspect of quality. And here you are with, among these learners, asking very intelligent questions and interacting with Georgia Tech professors. So I'm a firm believer that online modality improves opportunities for a lot more people without, if you do it right, without sacrifices on the quality.
Here's a question. And again, I'm just skipping around to some of the questions that are coming in here. We talk about credentials and the degrees, and Chris, you were talking about ways of measuring achievement in education. But this viewer is wondering if the degrees, as we think of them today, are just going to become obsolete or even unnecessary in the process of re-educating and retooling a workforce.
Policy. Well, there's some interesting models that are emerging. For example, some are arguing that instead of declaring a major, like I'm going to major in physics, you declare a passion, like I want to really help reduce climate change. And then instead of getting a set of courses in a major, you get a set of courses across different fields that prepare you when you graduate to act on your passion. I think that that's a powerful way of thinking about things. I think another piece of this is thinking of yourself as a suite of skills as opposed to thinking of yourself as a role. So if Harvard somehow comes terribly awry and I'm out on the street and I'm looking for another job as a faculty member, I'm pretty limited, especially given my age, as you pointed out earlier, in terms of getting that other job. But if I think of myself as somebody that's good at explaining complicated things to a wide variety of people, somebody who's good at listening and mentoring, somebody with a lot of contacts who can pick up the phone and link people up together, all of a sudden I've got a much wider range of jobs that I'm thinking about that I can do. So building it around passions rather than fields and building it around skills rather than roles, I think are important shifts in the kinds of empowerment that all of us have been talking about.
And playing devil's advocate, I'll go to another question here. And Andrew, maybe you can deal with this. The concept that a generation will not stay in a job for very long, that they will have many careers over time. Do we lose this depth of expertise that comes from spending so many years in one particular discipline that can be helpful from transporting from one generation to the next?
Certainly, but there are ways of sort of doing that intergenerationally. Of course, if life gets longer, you can still exploit that expertise, but you may still have to change your role. So I don't think it's necessarily inconsistent. And I think, you know, as Chris was saying, if you think about the ways that sort of tech is developing, synthesizing, dealing ambiguity and creating things is going to be a really, really important skill. And that may be something that stretches across many, many different sectors. I do think, not that degrees won't be useful, I just think we're going to see a plethora of other ways of measuring and assessing people's performance. And you know, degrees have a very mix of roles. One is kind of screening, one is actually proving competency. But I think they're going to change, and in particular, because I think soft skills are going to become really important. And you know, how we actually quantify and certify soft skills is going to be another big test.
And if I can just add to the conversation around alternative credentials, higher education is notorious. I mean, we are not good at eating our own dog food. We keep talking about alternative credentials, but then our job postings still ask for that, you know, either for filtering purposes or because, you know, we are just surrounded by bureaucracy and the job descriptions are what they are and we just need to, you know, abide by them. But I know instructional technology space, for example, is ripe with these communications. And then I look at my own job descriptions and there's no mention of alternative credentials and it's still the bachelor's and master's degree. So we need to shift from that as well and then start eating our own dog food.
That is one of the problems with the education sector and universities in particular. They are by design conservative institutions. You know, ranking and certificates have their value because they've been around for a long while, and how that's dealt with, I think, is going to be key for the success of universities and colleges relative to other suppliers.
Andrew, I know it drives you crazy when people start looking for problems that they're looking for reasons to criticize living longer in life. I can think of the argument that there's a great burden on Social Security, which I know you know is one of the big arguments out there. But you're a big proponent of looking for opportunities, and I have a question here from one of the viewers who was saying, you know, as we acquire new skills and knowledge over a lifetime, isn't one of those issues that comes up is it's a way for us to stay curious, to maintain our motivation, to identify interests, to, you know, to work well with others, even as we age in life.
100%.
Sounds like a question you might have written yourself, as a matter of fact.
I got another login somewhere. Yeah, and you know, this longevity issue is a huge one because it's both misunderstood and there's huge inequality. But on average, people are living longer and they're healthier for longer, which is a good thing. We've discovered that to a degree, age is malleable. We know that if we eat well, exercise well, have good relationships, have a fulfilling life, live in a good environment, we can live quite well. And maximizing that is going to be really important. But it does require kind of reinvesting in yourself continuously. And the mistake I think a lot of people make in looking at this increase in life expectancy that on average has happened is I think it's an extension of the end of life. Really what sort of happened is most of the extra years of life have come sort of at the end of middle age, 50 plus. There's like sort of 10 to 20 years added there. And that's the challenge career-wise, because you do then have to keep working for longer. But it's actually in reasonably good health if you maintain and look after yourself and have a good job, etc. So that's the challenge, and learning to reinvent yourself or to be flexible and have a sense of your identity that is not tied up into a job is going to be really important. And that's, I think, the key education skill that we have to try and bring out. What do I stand for? What are my values? And how do I react to these different circumstances?
Chris, one point that Andrew made in his book about how people are delaying things as we live longer, they're delaying some of the milestones in their lives, marriage and having children and so forth. What about education? Are you seeing older students in many of your graduate programs than you might have otherwise maybe 20 years ago?
Well, it's been very interesting at Harvard, the impact of the pandemic, because not only for its degrees outside of continuing education has Harvard gone to remote learning for the first time in its history, but in the School of Education, it's the first time that we've accepted part-time students for our master's degrees. And the pool of people who's applied is just extraordinary. People who would never have given up their job for a year to move to Boston, who were incredibly talented with wonderful life experience. Right. So actually it's enriched teaching, it's enriched the peer relationships within the students. And it may be that Harvard will be a little more flexible when the world goes back after the pandemic, because they've seen the kind of students that we can get in the door.
We are out of time, my friends. I appreciate all the time that we had here for this fascinating discussion. Andrew Scott from the London Business School, the author of 100-Year Life. Chris Dede, author of the 60-Year Curriculum. He's there at Harvard. Rovy Branon at the University of Washington's Continuum College. And Yakut Gazi from Georgia Tech, Personal Education. I'm Bill Griffith. Thank you for watching, everybody.